unless you had enrolled in CSC 220 with Dr. Michael Francois, the solution for our Module 3 content will serve as a bit of a refresher. So when we're talking about the stages of digital forensic activity, this is where we shift a gear and get a good bit more hands-on in terms of the course activities. Incident handling is a separate certification and actually a highly valued certification. It is directly tied to proper evidence collection or evidence preservation. When handling an incident, it is possible, without too much trouble, to completely destroy the integrity of digital evidence. And so this is kind of like a specialty area of digital forensics. Now, you'll recall that we've been differentiating between digital evidence specialists, the forensic expert or forensic analyst, and a digital evidence first responder. So this module is all about DEFR, and the goal is to master the knowledge, skills, and abilities to the extent that a baton can be passed in modules 4 and 5 to the digital evidence specialist. Okay, so the deep analysis, the data carving, the inspection of slack space, basic searches and queries with Wireshark logs and so on, those all come after. So when we're talking about incident handling, evidence collection, and data acquisition, the chain of custody is huge. So one of the things we have to understand is that proper incident handling, evidence collection, and data acquisition, if it's performed in a forensically sound manner, and that's something that you're going to hear over and over again from this point on in the course, right? Understanding the situation, SA stands for situational awareness. Situational awareness. Means, motive, and opportunity. The fact that you could have clandestine partners in a situation where an exploit has occurred. You don't always know who they are. Could be a coworker, could be a member of the IT staff. You'd be shocked at the allegiances and alliances they quickly form in a workplace where there's a lot of charged issues in play. That's whether it's a private investigation or a public investigation, whether it's informal or formal. Going into an incident, when you're considering the prospect of collecting evidence and acquiring data, right? You need to understand who the chain of command is. So there's two chains here, actually. We call it the chain of command and the chain of custody. Delineation of authority. Who authorizes you to go further? Oftentimes with live incident response, escalation in real time is a constant reality. So when you encounter things, you have to be able to take them to the next level. You have to be able to investigate further and expand the scope of the original charter. So you could start with an informal assistance, and then an incident presents. And in the middle of the incident, you have to check in with or loop in the authority, right? The people who authorize a change in scope, a change in authorization, right? And if you don't have a record of that, you're so screwed, right? When things quickly progress to the point where a problem becomes a criminal act, the chain of custody kicks in. So digital evidence has to be collected in a proper manner, right? You have to be able to preserve the chain of custody. If you drop the ball, you leave nothing for the digital evidence specialist. I mean, they could informally analyze things, but the confidence that you have, the ability of the leadership, the chain of command or leadership, those in authority who are making the informed decisions, their ability to have confidence and draw proper conclusions is compromised, because if the digital evidence isn't sound, they can't defend it in a court of law. They can't defend it in a lawsuit. They can't defend it in a termination action where a disgruntled employee decides to lawyer up and make life miserable for everyone. They can't pursue action against an adversary, somebody who is bound and determined to ruin their day, because they're the ones that should be getting all of the customers and not your company, right? So these are the realities of the workplace, and it is a dog eat dog world, and it pays considerable dividends. There's significant blessing from keeping that mindset in front of you. There are some mantras we've been mentioning to this point in our course. We've repeated over and over again. Can anybody recall some related phrases or mantras that we've been talking about? Just because you can doesn't what?
Doesn't mean you should.
Doesn't mean you should, right? Expect the what? Expect the unexpected. Have we stressed that a time or two along the way?
Yep.
You have to be prepared for the unexpected. In fact, the only thing that is a constant is that there will be change, right? That's another way of putting it. So preparation is the key. But even then, you can't prepare for everything, which is why your situational awareness, your rapport, and looping in those who authorize your activities, and your ability to think, okay, what am I looking at here? Is it possible I need to preserve this evidence? I have a screen. You're looking at a screen now. It looks a little suspicious. Is that something I'm going to need to preserve? It's a good practice to have video cameras rolling, to have digital camera equipment where you can stand at a distance from something as it's playing out, and then capture that event. So you could have a case where you have to reboot a system and it keeps barking at you and the screen locks up like it did at the beginning of this class. If you don't record that as part of the scenario, someone will assume that, well, you don't really know what you're doing. It was beyond your control and it was a event-driven priority. The group policy objects in a domain context can mandate that critical updates implement immediately, and spontaneous boots can happen, right? Spontaneous restarts can happen. So as far as general topics, this module, one thing that you're going to appreciate, I think, going forward is that the pace of this course is going to pick up considerably. So we'll be covering not more content, actually less content, but we'll be engaging more methods and hands-on. So if you've occasionally checked in with our classes each week on Tuesdays and Thursdays, you're going to want to make sure you're in class. I'm going to ask you to do some things and demonstrate some things with me, with your equipment, live. I'll demonstrate, then I want you to do it. I'll actually ask some of you to volunteer to share your screen live in class. to walk through a thing I just demonstrated? Just saying. Fair warning, okay? What does SAM stand for? Now, we just had it. I know it was long spring break. SAM is an acronym that stands for what? Can somebody unmute your mic and tell me you're still there?
Is it software assessment management?
Actually, there is management. It's security account management, right? You have the two models. So it's work group or standalone model versus domain. We made mention of how these two different models are profoundly different. But this is where the rubber meets the road. You're going to experience and engage some differences. So we're going to open up your hands-on environment to include a domain environment online. You'll need to be able to remotely access a system that's devoted or dedicated for your use, but it'll be in a domain, Active Directory domain context. And essentially, you know, as an extension of situational awareness, if you're in a domain environment, it's important to understand how logging and auditing may function very differently, how your ability to capture and retain page file memory, if in a domain environment, there are policies that enforce user profile. Is anyone familiar with what's called a roaming profile?
No.
Okay. Away we go. In what directory do we find user profile data stored?
Users?
In users, that's correct. In the users directory, you'll find a folder that has been named based on the account for that system. You're going to find a variety of weird stuff in here, and we've touched on some of this. In your earlier solution, you were asked to inspect this folder and then to look in the registry. And what we're looking for are orphaned or stray, what appear to be stray user directories. Oftentimes when a domain client is provisioned, when you set up, and I was just dealing with this over spring break, okay? So I have a son that's starting a new career in IT, and I'm really proud of him. And I just thought I would mention that in passing. In any case, all of you are familiar with user accounts in Control Panel, yes? All of you are familiar with the accounts option in settings, yes?
Yeah.
Okay. And you have other users here, right? See, it says device access, work or school users. When you're in a domain environment and add another user, one of the options to add an account is to add a domain account. But the problem is, in a domain environment, the computers belong to the domain. So when I look at my system and I look at, let's see. If I'm not in a work group and I'm part of a domain, if the computer belongs to the domain, quite often the default settings for computer use remain in place. It may surprise you to know that in a domain environment, there's a lot of granular restrictions for a user account where a specific computer can be designated for an individual's use. It's not commonly used. Let me see if I can access this to show you, because this is really fascinating stuff, and I'm gonna see if I can get in here. Yeah. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
So this is a virtual platform where I'm running systems, and we're going to create one just for you. I added a system to the domain. I have two domain controllers. One, of course, the naming convention here is based on astronomy, so I'm using the names of heavenly bodies, but you know, there's usually conventions in most places. The two domain controllers for this instructional domain, groovy.net, are Alnitak and Sirius. And I'm in the process of preparing to add another domain controller and promote from server 2019 to 2022. It's a common thing in IT shops as new versions of servers become available to migrate older systems into newer operating system platforms. The thing that I want you to be aware of is that Polaris is part of the domain. And because it's a part of the domain, and I'm really delighted to show this to you. I can log in on this machine. Everybody can still see my screen, yes?
Yeah.
So groovy.net is UVI with a GR in front of it, right? And groovy.net is the public domain. Groovy.local is the internal Active Directory domain. They both use DNS. And in a domain environment, the challenges of digital forensics take on a whole different level. Oh yeah, here we go. So Microsoft is pushing some serious stuff out. The thing that I want you to understand is that I just logged in with a local administrative account. But I've just confirmed that Polaris has been added successfully to the domain, which means that I can use a domain login to access this computer. And you're probably thinking, so what? Well, that's because the defaults are in effect. And what I mean by defaults is that for each user account, there are options that are rarely ever engaged. And the challenge here is, if I go into my control panel and I look at my user accounts, the only user account that you see, if I click to manage user accounts, there are no other user accounts at this point, right? I have not properly configured a domain user account. Does everybody see this?
Yeah.
Okay, if I go into settings, and I go into accounts, same thing shows. I go into other users and I have not added a work user. What you'll find is that on the domain controller, and this is just mind-blowing to me, because and if you're engaging the system security class, we're gonna play this up in a huge way. There are so many needless challenges. from my tools menu on the domain controller, I can actually access Active Directory users and computers, or I can pull it up from the start menu, but I'm going to show you from the domain level the security account management, because it's centralized, the operating system, the file system functionality and features have been greatly extended. So let's see if we have a user account. Luke, there you are.
Yep.
Okay. And Akeem. Yeah. And Shanoa. All right, so I'm gonna right click this and I'm gonna look at the properties of your user account. And it's embedded here. See where it says logon hours? Can everybody see
Yeah.
this?
Yeah,
You
we
know
can see
that-
it.
You know, people focus on this stuff and they focus on a few other things here. They rarely ever access this option and this option. Why am I saying this? You can establish logon hours for a user in a domain environment. Why is that significant in terms of digital forensics? Why would that matter? Let's take a case where logon hours are clearly established for a given user. Would that make a difference in terms of your situational awareness and what you're looking for?
Yeah, it can.
Okay. Can you say a little bit more about that? I don't want to put you on the spot, and anyone can feel free to unmute the mic and offer thoughts as well. Let's pretend that Luke has been restricted to access during business hours only. And you have some strange behavior and system logs. What would you like to do? Let's say that Luke is a person of suspicion. It's not accurate in real life, but we're just using a for instance here, okay? What would you be looking for with regard to Luke's account? If they were restricted to just one system and a time frame, just one system, Luke's office computer, that's it. That's all he's allowed to log in, and during logon hours, 9 to 5. If Luke was a person of suspicion, what would you check in the logs on other systems?
You would check to see if that account has been accessed on a different computer, or you would look for after hours logins.
Excellent. Yes. Yes. Outstanding. Yes, that's a perfect example. The sad reality is that very few domain environments actually use these two features. It's just nuts. I mean, it's just plain crazy. And the other thing too is that you can set up fully qualified domain names for logins. So you're not just using like a user account. There's all sorts of features that are never really engaged. It's quite often that this feature right here, password never expires. You'd be shocked at how often that is enabled at user request because, well, depending on what they're doing and the special features and functions of the system they're working, that those issues are a nuisance in terms of everyday workflow. So they'll put in a request and say, you know, do I really have to change my password every 30 days? And IT folks can do this kind of crap, right? They can basically check the box because, well, Luke is a friend of theirs and he doesn't like changing it every 30 days. And, you know, Luke does them a solid. So the point is, notice the unlock account option here, right? So you can have a case where basically a hacker is trying to frame Luke. So let's flip this scenario. Let's say that Luke is a person of suspicion, but people don't know yet that he's been made a patsy by a hacker. So Luke has some personal stuff that he'd like to keep personal, but you know, international hackers are very crafty and they get inside the soft underbelly of your personal habits. And let's say that they've decided Luke is an ideal target to frame for certain things. And it's going to filter back into his personal habits, right? So for whatever reason, you could be looking in the logs to see how many times they're attempting to log in. And if Luke has an alibi, if Luke is nowhere near a computer during those times, what would that tend to indicate with regard to Luke? Is that exculpatory or inculpatory evidence? If you were in Luke's shoes and you could prove that you were nowhere near a computer screen after hours, and we had unsuccessful attempts to use Luke's login on systems that he wasn't authorized to use, would that tend to be inculpatory or exculpatory evidence, given Luke could prove beyond a reasonable doubt he was nowhere near a computer screen?
Exculpatory.
Exculpatory is right. It would exonerate Luke. It would be the kind of evidence that you would want to capture and preserve. And then you would know, okay, we either have a malicious insider, right? We have somebody, Luke's coworker, doesn't like Luke. Oh, he's dating a former girlfriend. I hate Luke because Luke's the man. He's got a nice car and he stole my girl from me, right? Or Luke could be, you know, just a patsy. They've done their homework, they've done research on the institution, and he's just an unlucky guy, right? He's in the wrong place at the wrong time. Here's the part I want to share with you. In a domain environment, you can specify that the user profile is stored instead. This is where we come full circle, okay? We started our review of the domain SAM, and in terms of situational awareness, there are many mid-size and larger domain environments that have the muscle, have the infrastructure. They're proud of their network. They are pleased to share with their customers how they have state-of-the-art facilities and they have, you know, ultra encryption on their wireless networks and so on and so forth. The home folder for the user profile for that login, that's not in the user's directory, right? It's not here. It's inside somewhere else, right? So it's not in the user's directory. I'm looking at Rigel now, that's the host. So actually what I should do is look at Polaris, right? If I look in the C drive under users, I'm going to find that there might be a shell of a directory. So when you look in users, you'll find that there's a login directory because a domain user logged in. So the user directory was built. But if this other feature is engaged, let me see. If this other, I'm on Polaris, I got to get back to here. Excuse me just a moment. If this other feature is engaged in the domain, user profile can be stored on a network share, a redundant, fault-tolerant file system cluster, ultra fast, ultra resilient, right? And the profile for that user path is on it's on that cluster. So the file name doesn't even refer to a server name. The // server name or the file path doesn't include a UNC for a specific server. Instead, it points to a cluster of servers, and the cluster has a name, And so there are multiple copies. And this is just as fast as a local SSD drive, right? So they log in, and wherever they log in, that server stored profile path populates to the machine. And there's otherwise, when you look on that machine, it's like, hey, there's nothing in here, right? So when you look on the machine itself, you might see a shell of a profile, but you're going to scratch your head and say, I know Luke has 10 gigs of data. Where the hell's the 10 gigs of data, right? I see a directory there, but I don't see 10 gigs of data. Now, here's the frightening part to me, and this is where IT folks, this is full disclosure, 25 years of exposing how incompetent most IT staff are. Watch what happens next. I'm on Polaris. I just joined the domain. I've only used a local administrator to log in. That's why you see the profile here. Everybody sees this, right?
Yeah, we see it.
Yeah. And I haven't even renamed this computer. I usually do that just so when I'm logged in remotely, I know I'm on Polaris, right? So instead of saying this PC, I like to see as a best practice when I'm in there, oh, I'm on Polaris. I open up File Explorer, it says I'm on Polaris, right? Isn't that nice? If I have an OS volume that's on something other than a C drive, I change whatever drive letter, change the name so that I know where the OS volume is. And then when I refresh my screen, I know exactly where my stuff is, right? There's the OS volume. I have other drive letters. That's the name of the system I'm on. These are things that I do to make forensics easy. This is stuff you can advocate as a digital forensic specialist with customers where you want to develop their forensic capacity. These are best practices. But getting back to this, I'm using a local account. This is a domain computer. I'm going to do something on the domain level. I want domain policies and procedures to apply to this. When I add a computer to the domain, it's supposed to belong in an organizational unit in the domain. This is like a systems engineering, systems architecture thing for Active Directory. You'll notice here that I have Orion and Pegasus. They're in the domain, and then they're in the STX organizational unit. This is an object of the domain in Active Directory to which I can apply group policies. One confusing thing for IT folks is that group policies in an Active Directory domain do not apply to group security groups. Group policies do not apply to security groups. Let me say that again. One more time. Domain group policies to enforce restrictions in a domain context where everything is centrally managed, they don't apply at all to security groups. They're applied to organizational units, to a domain, to a site, or to the local computer, a local system. So those group policies can have a profound effect, and there's a precedence. So local policies take precedent over just plain settings on a computer, a site. So local is also overwritten by site. If I have a certain screensaver I want on STX, welcome to St. Croix, Albert A. Sheen campus. I can have a screensaver that I dictate that shows up as a screensaver on all my office PCs, all my student workstations, all my library computers. It says, welcome to Albert A. Sheen campus on St. Croix, right? I can apply a group policy to the site on St. Thomas, different screensaver. Welcome to the Orville E. Keene campus on St. Thomas, right? I can apply to the site, I can apply to the domain, or I can apply to OUs. If I apply to OUs, those take precedence over everything. Now, in this case, I haven't created a separate site. I've created separate OUs for each campus. That's just a matter of convenience or preference. Where are we going with this? When you first join a domain, another lazy thing that IT staff do, when a computer joins the domain, it's deposited in the computer's folder or directory. This is not an organizational unit. Group policies do not apply to this container. What am I saying? If lazy IT people join computers to the domain, or they have to leave the domain and rejoin the domain because they've been powered off for more than 30 days and a computer loses its way, it has to get back on the domain. If you're in the IT shop, you know what I'm talking about. Sometimes you have to leave the domain, join a work group, then rejoin the domain using an administrative account, right? When that happens, the computer account is placed in the computer's object, but it's not an organizational unit. It is not a site object. It is not a domain object. It's just a storage container. And no group policies apply to that computer unless you move this. I'm going to move this to the EA. Actually, I'm going to move it into the domain controller's OU because this is going to become a domain controller. I'm going to say, yes, I know when I move it, there are going to be policies that apply. Now, when I look, Polaris is in here, okay? And this is where you find out the global catalog, and this is how you find out that something's a domain controller. In any case, I'm getting this ready to replace the role from last year of a previous domain controller. The point I'm trying to make is that a lot of times things are supposed to work like they're supposed to in a domain environment, and they don't because you have lazy IT people, or uninformed IT people, or untrained IT people, or uncertified IT people. And as a digital forensics expert, you need to understand how those minor subtle things can make a huge difference in terms of where you're looking for what. Features and functions that may or may not be used. A hacker can get on the domain controllers and engage some of these features and leave everybody with their head scratching because these features and functions are engaged, but nobody knows why or how it is. Now, what I'm going to do finally to demonstrate this most important aspect of the SAM. By the way, this is the first season that digital forensics students will engage acquisition both in a domain environment and in a standalone workgroup context. So that's one reason why what you're receiving this morning is new information. And there will likely be an update or additional material posted in the addendum. I'm on Polaris now. I'm going to log out and I'm going to log in, this time with a domain account, only I'm not going to go through the process of setting up a user account properly in Control Panel. I'm not going to go into settings and set up a work account properly. I want you to see what happens. All I've done is join this to the domain, and I'm going to log out and then sign in with the domain account. Everybody with me? Are we still here?
Yeah, still here.
Okay. Other user. Everybody see now? I can sign in on Polaris /administrator, or I can sign in Groovy and use a domain account. This next part, I hope, will really disturb you or inspire you. Not sure which, but we're almost done. We have 3 minutes. Do you see the word Polaris here?
No.
Did you see the typical screen when a new user logs in? When a new user logs in for the first time, it usually says, oh, we're building your profile for you. Did you see that in this case?
No.
No, you didn't. Okay. What about this?
No.
Okay, I'm obviously looking at this system from a different login. Here's the fun part. Are you ready? I have a user profile in here. See, I have not set up restrictions for login schedule. I have not set up restrictions for login to specific systems. In a domain environment, any domain user can log in where? On any domain computer. For those of you in ITS, you know what I'm talking about. Can't you go into the users folder on a computer lab system? And what do you see in the users?
The past users not logged in.
Yes, and they're identified by what? Student ID number. And is that good if you open up somebody's user folder and you get into their documents and it has their name on it? Is that a good idea for like student ID number to be in the users? I'm just saying, if I were in a campus system and I had all sorts of students, different students logging in on any system anywhere in the UVI domain, it's going to create a user profile based on their login identity, which isn't a formal username based on their first initial or last name. It's their student ID. It's their 900 or 9000 number. So if they're doing things on that system and they put anything into the My Documents folder by default, or on the desktop by default, right? What's going to happen is that there's going to be breadcrumbs in there that identify that user by name, if they put their name on anything, inside that ID folder. But that's not the big problem. The big problem is when you're doing your work as a digital forensic specialist, if you don't understand this dynamic in the business world where there are domains active, one reality is that you don't have just one system you need to investigate. If it's possible for any user to log in on any domain computer, what's the reality about looking for user data? What's just happened to your scope? Put another way, how many systems in the domain do you need to check for that user profile data?
One.
Any system they logged into. That user, if they've logged in on any or all of the other systems, if they roam and they use different systems. Now, do most users walk into someone else's office and log in? The reality is some do and some don't. Some understand how domains work, and the technically savvy hackers understand they can create all kinds of havoc. They can get on one screen they have no business being on, but the fact that somebody's away on vacation for a week gives them a chance to do, oh, I have to go into so-and-so's office, I need some files or folders in there. When they're in there, they're on a coworker's screen. The computers in that domain could have user profile for a single user on half the systems in that domain. Holy buckets. I just want you to be aware of how this works for situational awareness. That's why your chain of authority or your delineation of authority is so critical. You have to be able to explain this in plain terms to people and say, look, and they're going to say, all right, this is Luke we're talking about. Let's go full circle and then we'll close. Okay. Where did we start? We started talking about Luke, right? Wasn't that the context?
Yeah, it was.
So we were talking about Luke. You know what people are going to say? The people you work for are going to say, wait a second, you're saying that if we're checking the dipstick on Luke's activity, that you're not just going to look at Luke's screen. And what you're going to have to articulate or explain is that in a domain environment, that's right. If these settings are not used, if they're not utilized effectively, you will have all kinds of problems. And this means that you're going to go into a forensic scenario and attempt to serve a broader interest. And unless you can explain to the leadership, that's right, we're not just looking at Luke's screen. Did he borrow any laptops? Was he part of a presentation? Did he sign on to a classroom computer? Where are his classroom computers? How often has Luke logged into those classroom computers? Which computer labs does Luke frequent? Which systems in the computer labs does Luke use? Your ability to find data associated with Luke's activity depends on your free access to any and all systems where Luke may have logged in. Because why?
The IT folks are lazy or untrained or uncertified. And it's time for most IT staffs to buck up, get real, understand the dynamic in the world we live in now, and do the things they need to do to be competent professionals. One of our jobs is not to scare the crap out of them or intimidate them or belittle them or demean their profession, but we have to be agents. We have to be educators, education, awareness, and training. One of our biggest challenges is getting our IT staff to understand best practices on the front side of things before you have to go digging for a needle in a haystack. Okay? Now,
Based on the information presented, can you think of any questions or concerns given the concepts I've just shared with you?
I put one in the chat.
You put one in the chat. Excellent. Hang on. Okay. Yeah, because what we did was cover about, I don't know, 5 to 10 years of systems engineering concepts and an Active Directory concept in like 30 minutes of class time. Let me get the chat here. So can you use this to deploy updates across all computers? Yes, the answer is you can use this environment to push very effectively. In fact, we cover that in our 255 course, the Operating Systems Deployment Best Practices. You can use Active Directory to deploy applications, installs, and Windows updates across all the computers on the domain. Yes, you can. You can use those organizational units and domain containers to drive the whole process. And basically your IT staff simply check on the screens and make sure that they're implementing. One of the most common things that you have to do for that type of scenario is to Let me show this to you. So thank you for asking that question. If I'm in whoa. I gotta get back into here. Let's go back to here. So your question was, can we use the domain to drive updates? Essentially, you can use group policies to enforce updates and to push them as long as they're in the right organizational unit. But one of the most common things that IT people will need to do is to go to each workstation and enter this command, okay? And it can be a part of login or log out. So you can include it in a login script or a log off script. This is really, really critical. So how is it that IT staff can yoke this the most effectively? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a really cool thing that you asked, and I'm really glad you asked it. I just want to make sure it's large enough so you can see this. Okay, so there's a command that you should implement. And usually when there are group policies that are changed in a domain and you want to make those, you want to make sure that those apply properly. So you change a setting, you want to make sure that updates are pulled from the local the software update server, Windows Software Update Services. It's called WSUS. It's a single server, and it loads these updates lightning fast, and they're pushed with policies. In each of the domain computers, you can basically script some logon and sign off statements that automatically execute. And it's real simple. You can get your users to help you. You basically tell them over the phone, okay, I want you to sign out and then sign back in again. And when they sign off, the GP update force executes, and then the policy change applies to the system, and it's fixed, right? It's a thing of beauty when it works right. When it works right. But you have to set up the platforms to utilize this stuff. So thank you for asking that. Your IT team are some of your greatest challenges, and in some cases your worst enemies in a forensic scenario, especially if they're allied with a person who has if they're in the mix and they're part of the perpetrators, then that's formidable, and they can keep you running around in circles, especially if they understand how this stuff works and they're using it against you. Your goal is to understand enough about how this works and to delineate your authority and to have a certain amount of latitude and discretion to work with the leadership so they can make informed decisions. And you want to educate, you want your IT staff to be aware, and you want to train them how to use this stuff the best, so that when you are facing corporate or government agency forensic challenges, you have the tools and the means. The stuff is rigged and the infrastructure is configured to support that interest. If you don't have that on the front side, it's terrible. I would love to post this video in particular in YouTube and send a link to everybody I know in government and in mid-sized to larger companies, so they understand how the situational awareness changes for better and for worse in a domain environment as opposed to a work group. So are there any other questions or comments or concerns before we close? All right. Well, I will post some additional detail related to what was presented today in the addendum for this Module 3 study guide, and we'll see you on Tuesday at 9 a.m. Thanks for joining us.